So now I would like to invite Peter Walls to the stage. Peter.
Thank you, Jessica. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. In 2003, I attended the New Zealand Music Awards in Auckland on behalf of the NZSO to accept the Best Classical Album Award for Douglas Lilburn's 3 symphonies. I stood on the Aotearoa Centre stage looking every bit like one of those bureaucrats in Don McGlashan's song Wellington and feeling like an alien from somewhere more remote than Mars, which may be a way of saying that I'm probably deeply unqualified to introduce tonight's speaker. But I had a great night and came away with just huge admiration for the creativity of artists like Bikrunga, Nesian Mystic, the Datsons and Rhombus. Don McGlashan is, of course, very well used to award ceremonies. He'd received the APRA Silver Scroll for Anchor Me in 1994 and was back in 2006 for Bathe in the River. In 2023, he joined Douglas Lilburn in the New Zealand Music Hall of Fame. So would Douglas like to have been here tonight? I'm sure that the composer of Sings Harry would love to hear what this great songwriter has to say about his art. And after years of writing for Ngaio Marsh Productions, a song that began Full Fathom 5 would surely have grabbed his attention. The composer of 3 poems of the sea, 3 sea changes, and soundscapes with lake and river would have warmed to Don's theme. If I may appropriate another line from Wellington, we might worry that the problem is the gap. There's no easy way to reconcile it. The idea of spanning a gap, of having strong credentials in a very wide stylistic range, was very much in our minds when the Lilburn Trust Music Advisory Committee unanimously agreed to see if Don might be willing to give this year's Lilburn Lecture. Little did we know that this would also be the year that Shirley Horrocks' documentary Anchor Me would be screened at the Puna Mātauranga International Film Festival. That means there's probably not much I can say about Don that you won't already know. I've invoked his name and fame often enough as a role model for my grandson who's been learning French horn, and I also had the privilege of being on the board for the World Choir Games in Auckland last year, where again there was huge support for John Ross's inspired idea of inviting Don to compose the official song, Te Tokea Tangata, breathing in, breathing out. Who better to reach across the diverse cultures and the broad stylistic range evident at this enormous choral event? Don grew up in Auckland, began learning cello and piano at age 7, and at some stage worked his way through a tune a day for just about every instrument. Why didn't I think of doing that? It's fantastic preparation for anyone that wants to be a conductor or any other sort of musician, I think. He played horn and percussion in the Auckland Symphonia across those crucial years when it first collapsed and then re-emerged as the Auckland Philharmonia, thanks to the determination of a group of players who called themselves the Phoenix Group. And I quite fondly remember from that group another horn player, John Ure. At Auckland University, Don studied music and English, an indication perhaps that his extraordinary poetic gifts have deep roots. In the 1980s, Don became a member of Phil Dadson's From Scratch Ensemble, a group that's just completed a 7-concert tour for Chamber Music New Zealand, although without Don, of course. From there to Blam Blam Blam, and then the dramatic duo, which became the trio, The Front Lawn, many of whose films are still available on the NZ On Screen website. It strikes me that The Front Lawn's quirky little dramas point us to something quite important in Don's songwriting, where he so often adopts a dramatic persona as a way into his theme. Think of The Queen's English, where he assumes the voice of a US congressman to parody a myopic, imperialistic, monocultural perspective, MAGA avant la lettre. From there to the legendary Muttonbirds, who thrived here and in the UK for a decade before Don started focusing on solo projects from about 2003. Don's songs often take their point of departure from an historic and traumatic event, such as Parihaka, the Keita toy factory fire in Thailand, or the Aotearoa massacre. But the scenarios they evoke always encourage us to think about ongoing current issues. The toy factory fire, for instance, captures the tragic folly of bottom-line-led complacency and compromise so evident in the recent River movie. The amendments to New Zealand's health and safety legislation currently under consideration remind us that this is an ongoing risk. The toy factory song exposes, on the one hand, the pitfalls of out-of-sight manufacturing that are at the heart of globalization, and on the other hand, the fallacy of trickle-down economics. I quote the marketing manager in the song, "Because people like us, we do make the world better, and if it's better for us, it's better for everyone." Above all, there's a deep humanity in Don's writing. The beautiful Envy of Angels, written as a tribute to his father, transforms an engineer's almost clinical observations into a moving statement about the mysteries of creation and of our responsibilities to each other. And if I could quote it, "Look over there, you used to say, the shape of the land beneath the street, ridges and valleys and underground streams. You have to know what's under your feet so you can make things strong enough to take the weight of all the people who haven't been born." So this is music that matters. So it's with great pleasure that I ask Don McGlashan to talk about bodies of water. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui.
Oh, how lovely. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora e hoa mā, kia ora rangatira mā, kia ora ngā tangata ataahua o te upoko o te ika. Ko Don McGlashan tōku ingoa, ko ingarangi me aerana, me kōtirana, te whakapaparanga mai. Engari, ko Aotearoa taku ūkaipō. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Okay, a lot's been going on for me in the last year or two. As Peter said, I've been invested into the New Zealand Music Hall of Fame. I haven't met Douglas Lilburn yet, but I hope to. A documentary's been made about me, and I've put out a new live album, among many other things. When I was asked to do this lecture, I thought, haven't the public seen enough of me lately? Well, apparently not. I felt exhausted after the documentary, even though I wasn't making the film, I was just having the camera pointed at me. But I also felt paradoxically that I'd love to have a go at answering all the questions that occurred to me after the camera was turned off. Not for my profile or for posterity, just so that I could get things straight in my own head. So I said yes, and here I am. I called this talk Bodies of Water because I was asked to give it a title. I'm not sure how relevant lakes, inlets, rivers will be, but they do tend to interpose themselves in my writing, so let's see. I go swimming a lot, either where I live half the year with my lovely wife Anne in Vancouver, in a place called English Bay, or when I'm back in Auckland the other half of the year at Point Chevalier, or one of the tidal mudflat bays on the Titirangi shore. I'm a fairly confident swimmer, but I always feel fear at that first dive, pushing off and then coming up, breaststroking. The childlike fear of what's underneath, what snag I might hit, what aquatic creature might come up and bite me, what clammy weeds might brush against me. Then there's pushing through that fear and feeling the joy of moving in a new medium. All of that, for me, completely mirrors jumping off trying to write a song, jumping off into try to write a new song. The initial fear of coming up with something hackneyed and useless. Then on a good day, there's the blessed transformation when I realize I'm moving in a new medium that was threatening before, but now is bearing me along on its own currents. Then there's water as a metaphor for the subconscious. C.K. Stead in, I think, the new poetic Yeats to Eliot, talks about the subconscious as being where all the good stuff comes from, the clear way we see the world, our own authentic voice. But we have no control over when that good stuff is going to be obliging and come out. All we can do is to keep our tools sharp so that when it does arrive, we can go to work on it effectively. I love that, keep our tools sharp. So we live on the surface, but the subconscious is below us and available to us. As writers, we tap into the subconscious every time we reach a fork in the road. Shall I do it this way or that way? And when we make a choice and the subconscious agrees with us, there's a satisfying click, like the door of an expensive European car closing. I also sometimes see bodies of water as representing our relationship with time. The future is like the sky, okay? The past is underwater, and the present is what's in between. The surface of the sea, the lake, the river, the tiny skin between two vast elements. It's a cramped space, but that's where we live, sliding along, trying not to capsize. The future is unknowable, unattainable. In the present, we're too busy trying to concentrate on anything but our immediate concerns. So in terms of raw materials, that only leaves us with the past, which is like a lake that's been formed by a hydro scheme. Trees, streets, empty buildings, ghostly, dark, washed by invisible currents. We can dive in there and see what we can find. Then there's the real sea around us here in Aotearoa. Not a metaphor, just the real thing. Very big, very wet. An unimaginable challenge for the brilliant Polynesian navigators who first found these islands. A leap into the unknown for the Pākehā families who were pushed by social injustice at home and pulled by the false advertising of outfits like the New Zealand Company. And now a barrier between us and the world, keeping us a long way away from everything while keeping us relatively safe from invaders, so far anyway. It has a huge impact on the music industry here. If you're in a band in Belgium, you can load your gear in a van and drive to many countries. Much harder to do that in New Zealand. If I go too fast, you just yell at me to slow down. I'm really used to hecklers, so yeah. The sea for New Zealanders is like outer space. Our sense of emptiness out there should make us, all of us, more acutely aware of the need to look after this country of ours. This raft that we're all clinging to is the only one we've got. We have a deep, respectful, existential fear of the sea, and so we should. But the sea's also something that we love. We swim, surf, paddle, dive, fish in it, walk beside it, sail boats on it, pay an arm and a leg to live anywhere near it. But whether we're playing in it or just standing, looking at it and wondering, we need it. It's deep inside us, like the plains are for Albertans or the mountains are for Tibetans. That unlikely combination of a very sensible fear and a paradoxical love makes us who we are. So that's my thoughts about bodies of water. And now this is kind of the autobiographical bit. I was the third of 4 kids brought up on the north shore of Auckland. My parents moved there in the 1950s when anything north of Takapuna was considered a wilderness inhabited by eccentrics and social credit voters. About 2 years before I was born, my dad, who was an engineer with the Harbour Board, got a scholarship to live in Holland and do the equivalent of a master's in engineering at Delft University. My mum, dad, older brother and older sister sailed off on the impressively named Dominion Monarch. The trip took 2.5 months via Sydney, the Pacific Islands, the Panama Canal and Cape Town. They lived in The Hague for over a year, all learning enough Dutch to get by. Later on, back in New Zealand, when I and my younger sister joined the family, the older kids and my parents would sometimes slip into Dutch to talk about stuff that we littlies weren't allowed to hear. My mother was orphaned as an infant and was brought up in Mount Eden by a much-loved Glaswegian governess and by distant, stern uncles and aunts. She was a boarder at St Cuthbert's School for Girls and eventually head girl. She studied Shakespeare at university and went back to teach immediately at St Cuthbert's. She was a gentle, absent-minded person who loved poetry and music and played the piano better than she thought she did. When she went back to teaching after her 4 kids were fledged, she was the kind of teacher that people always remember. I can't count the number of punters who've come up to me after shows and told me that they wouldn't be who they were today had they not had my mum for 5th form English, or had she not gone into bat for them when she was a school guidance counsellor and they were in trouble with the police. My dad grew up in mining towns, Hikurangi, Huntly, Renown, where his father was a mine engineer. Granddad was a garrulous, hard-drinking man with a class-driven chip on his shoulder, which dictated that no son of his could mix with miners' kids, meaning that, apart from sentencing my dad to a pretty lonely childhood, it meant that he wasn't allowed to play in the local brass band, which is usually the only music going in those small towns. To get around this, my dad famously dug a hole at the far end of the backyard, covered it with corrugated iron, and crouched in there on cold nights to practice his cornet before sneaking off to band practice. It was an illustration of his love of music and his grit. When my granddad was drunk, he was abusive towards my granny, and my dad, even in his early teens, often had to step in and protect her. When Mum brought Dad to meet the aunts and uncles, he must have seemed a shy, odd man, fiercely intelligent, a bit rough around the edges, passionate about engineering, but without much conversation. If they disapproved, she didn't listen. She had plenty of grit too. Because both my parents were teachers, we had long holidays together as a family, and we'd spend most of them on Pakihi Island at the bottom end of the Hauraki Gulf, where we had an acre of land and a batch that my dad had built. Us kids would play go home, stay home in the shearing shed at South Bay. Once tagged, your home was next to the chutes that the newly shorn sheep slid down into the holding pens under the building. This meant that intrepid players who were on your team could shinny up the chutes, tag you and free you, slipping on the lanolin-smoothed wood. Us 4 kids, plus any friends we'd brought, would play all day until dusk when we'd hear my father start the generator over in North Bay, the signal for us to find our way back to the batch. I can remember standing in the water at South Bay at twilight, hearing the disembodied voices of net fishers about 3 miles away across the firth at Kawakawa Bay. It was as if they were standing next to us. My mother would talk about how Māori might have explained those phenomena with stories about fairy-like beings. Patu paiarehe was the word I later learned, or the selkies of Irish and Scots tradition. My dad explained that it was because of the warm layer of air trapped close to the sea at that time of day, sound waves bouncing across it like electrons down a wire. Now, my dad wasn't without poetry, but his was the poetry of the landscape, the forces that made it. Walking along a beach, he would often bend down, pick up a rock, and tell me stories about ancient heat and violence, lines of hot quartz pushing up through the chert and manganese. In Milford, our family had a brick-based weatherboard house near Lake Pupuke in Waterloo Road. All the street names celebrate English history. Every victory of Admiral Nelson has its own street or cul-de-sac, and the lake is bounded by Shakespeare, Kitchener, Hurstmere roads. There's even a Byron Avenue. The street naming committee must have opted to gloss over Byron's drug-taking and sexual proclivities. They did have standards, though. Percy Shelley and Oscar Wilde didn't get a look in. The lake is a strong part of my life and always has been. I race my laser on it when I'm back in New Zealand, and I dream about it when I'm away. Sometimes those dreams have hippopotamuses in them. I'm not sure what that's about. The lake is round, about 1 kilometre in diameter, and as kids we would thrill to stories about how it was bottomless and magical. My dad would tell us it wasn't. In fact, he'd tell us that at one time it was the main water reservoir for the North Shore, but it was the magical stuff that stuck. Maurice G. picked up this mythic quality when he wrote Under the Mountain. In that story, the lake, the same lake, is a vast petri dish for awful slug-like creatures who could slither through underground tunnels out to Rangitoto, where they'd wait till the time came for them to take over the world. We didn't know it at the time, but that part of the shore had a lot of writers around then. Frank Sargison, and for a brief period Janet Frame, lived on the other side of the lake in Esmond Road. Carl and Kay Stead lived there too, I think. Certainly Keith Sinclair and family. Kendrick Smitherman and his wife Mary Stanley were just around the corner from us. Mary Stanley was a fine poet in her own right, but my family and I just knew her as Mrs. Smitherman, the remedial teacher at Milford Primary School, where we all went. She wasn't much older than my mum, but she had bad arthritis, although that didn't change how kind and patient she was with her students. At Milford School, which is right next to Lake Pupuke, aged about 6, along with a girl called Jill, who was pretty much my only friend. I read everything very fast. So once or twice a day, Jill and I had to be sent out of the classroom to read to each other so that the class could catch up. We would take out those tiny little metal and wood chairs, we'd take them out into the vestibule of the prefab and sit amongst the wet coats, reading at our own pace. I used to love that. Sometimes we'd forget ourselves and would stay there reading even when the bell rang for little play or big play or even lunchtime. And the other kids would rampage out into the trees by the lake, the boys forming gangs and fighting, and the girls hanging by their legs from the jungle gym like rows of little bats. Do they do that in Wellington, or is that just an Auckland thing? Any women that remember hanging by their knees from the jungle? Why did you do that? I talked about it to a woman in Auckland a little while ago, and she said, oh yeah, that was the thing. We used to have special underpants to wear, But I digress. That's not really... In mid to late 60s, my big brother and I would listen to the Kinks and the Beatles under the bedclothes after lights out. My big sister had a battery-powered Philips turntable with little plastic speakers that formed a lid. I would take that outside and listen to Mary Poppins and the Sound of Music soundtracks, and later on to the Beatles cover of Arthur Alexander's Anna, such a wonderful song. I'd also puzzle over the lyrics of the Rolling Stones' Mother's Little Helper. I was a highly strung, tantrumy child, very distracted at school, prone to shouting out ideas at the wrong time and getting into trouble. I couldn't finish anything because I'd already done it in my head. I felt there was something wrong with me because everybody else could finish their work and I couldn't. I don't think they knew about ADHD then, or if they did, it hadn't filtered through to the North Shore of Auckland. Around 7 or 8, I discovered that I could make the class laugh, and sometimes that made up for my growing sense of shortcomings, but not always. I had bad asthma, and if other children did come round to our house, it would often end in tears with me having a tantrum or an asthma attack, or both. Our family doctor, bless him, prescribed heavy doses of anthosan for me. Anthosan's a revolting green oral antihistamine, which I think is illegal nowadays, except as a skin cream. For a while there, I would knock back a large dessert spoonful of that stuff before going to school. I'd be a bit sleepy and spacey, but I wouldn't get into trouble, and my handwriting would be legible. I took piano lessons aged about 7 from an intimidating old man named Eric Bell who lived near Milford Beach. He had had an illustrious career, evidently. He once had a regular slot on the radio playing some kind of newfangled organ called the Novacord. But teaching me wasn't his favourite thing, and he used to whack my hands with a ruler when I played the wrong notes. A bit later, I started cello with a local Saturday morning music school. Around then, another teacher at Milford School brought in an adult friend of hers who had a snare drum to demonstrate to the class. He was in his 20s, I guess, and painfully shy, absolutely stricken at having to stand in front of the class of small wriggling children. But then he played a roll, and time stopped for me. His 2 hands almost still, the ends of the sticks bouncing almost imperceptibly to make one long sound like rain on a roof, a sound which he could control, make louder or softer at will just by raising or lowering his shoulders. I was spellbound. And when the class was over, I ran home to tell my parents. Some months later, the teacher who ran the orchestra at the Saturday morning music school must have been racking her brains to find something which would make me less disruptive. And she came up with a 1/4-inch reel-to-reel recording of a piece from Handel's Fireworks music, Movement 6, Minuet 2. Yum, dum, da, dum, 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 da, dum, da. Beautiful piece. There's no snare drum part. Handel didn't write one. But sometimes people would throw in a percussion for special occasions. This teacher found a recording of just such an occasion and gave it to me to write out the part and learn it. My dad had a reel-to-reel tape machine that he used to use to listen to choir stuff on, and he let me use it. I still remember the part. The snare drum sort of divided and like doubled it. So the music was going yum dum dee dum 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 da dum da. The snare drum was going yum da dum 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 da dum. So exciting. I still remember that. It must have been a very strange sight, a very small, very serious boy with flaming red hair, blushing madly, putting down his cello and then leaving the orchestra midway through the concert and coming back carrying a snare drum on a stand at least as big as him to play the snare drum, to play the part. Around this time, I started learning drums from an austere, dignified woman in Birkenhead called Mrs. Notton, then trumpet with Hugh Dixon across the bridge in Epsom, a testament to my parents' commitment, and then euphonium. Hugh Dixon reckoned that my teeth were too crooked for me to ever be a good trumpeter, but later I secretly suspected that he needed a euphonium in his Auckland Youth Symphonic Band. And he'd also twigged that my parents were probably long-suffering enough to fork out the money for one. When I was 8 in Standard 4, everybody had to do a project on India. Most of the children did some kind of wall-mounted display that took them weeks with a fair bit of parental involvement, with pictures cut out of magazines, bits of careful joined-up writing, maps with bits of string connecting them. I was too disorganised for that, so at the last minute, I took 2 other boys out into the corridor and I worked out what I thought sounded like a Hindu rain song, harmonised in open fifths. Geography wasn't my strong point, and I think it was more American Indian than subcontinental Indian, more Tonto than Ravi Shankar, shall we say. But I thought it sounded cool. The class had to choose the best project by the volume of their applause. The teacher, Miss Ransom, pointed at the different projects. When she pointed at me, the 3 of us just stood up and sang, and the class went crazy. Miss Ransom was livid. She said, and I remember this verbatim, "You, class, you have allowed yourselves to be fooled by a song. We are not going to give Donald the prize for best project because that song was just something he made up. Whereas other children have worked really hard and copied things out of proper books." Miss Ransom was a good teacher, and I later found out that she had a soft spot for me. But she felt she needed to clamp down on me lest I relied too much on making stuff up, rather than applying myself to real work. Alas, I didn't listen, and I've been fooling people with my songs ever since. My mum gave me poetry books that she was teaching from at school, and I was also a member of the Ashton Scholastic Book Club. I remember waiting at the letterbox, feeling really special because of all the children in the street. The books I'd ordered were coming from me alone. When I was 13 or so, my friends Rob, Mark, Simon and I would go down to the derelict pool near Milford Beach to race little boats that we'd made. They were beautiful small pieces of craft, inch-to-the-foot scale models of the 12-foot Cherub-class yachts we were obsessed with, framed balsa wood hulls, stuck together with model aeroplane glue, and waterproofed with fiberglass resin. Sails that we'd sewed from real spinnaker cloth offcuts and a walnut-sized lump of lead at the bottom of the centreboard for ballast. We'd set them off close-reaching across the pool, sprint round the other side, adjust the sails a bit and let them go again to broad reach back to the other side. In high school, I started reading the poems of Roger McGough, Brian Patton, Robert Bly, Zbigniew Herbert. In the spring of 1974, when I was 15, my beloved older brother Alec, Sandy to the family, died in a boating accident off Pakihi Island with 2 of his friends. They'd planned a trip over to the island on Labour weekend, but the weather blew up, as it often does around that time of year, and their open boat was swamped. I came to school the next day, not knowing what else to do. I remember my music teacher, Terence Maskell, quietly handing me a book of the Bach chorales, edited by Albert Riemenschneider. I will always thank him for that. I don't remember much about the time after my brother's accident, but I do remember reading and rereading Mary Stanley's poetry. In her, I think, only published volume of work, a small book called Starveling Year, that was shunned by the poetry patriarchy of the day. In a poem called The Wife Speaks, she says, "I close my books and know events are people. All roads everywhere walk home women and men to take history under their roofs. I see Icarus fall out of the sky beside my door, not beautiful, envy of angels, but feathered for a bloody death." She must have known Auden's poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts, written less than 20 years before, where No matter what terrible or dramatic things are happening in the world, the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Auden mentions Icarus too in this poem. The sun shone, as it had to, on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had some way to get to, and sailed calmly on. Even at 15, I kind of knew that Mary Stanley was talking about the same thing, but in a way that was more close-up and more human, not standing back and shaking her head at the absurd tragedy of Icarus falling, but rather imagining what it would feel like to be his mother holding him as he bleeds. I thought of my own mother grieving for her son, and I also thought of her predicament 20-odd years earlier, arriving on the shore, having been a Shakespearean scholar at university, now surrounded by all that literary energy that she was far too shy to have anything to do with. They weren't a very social couple. My dad was a Freemason, which pretty much dealt to his social life, and my mum occasionally was invited to events for Freemasons' wives, where the talk was mainly about lamingtons and children, I guess. I often wonder how different things might have been if she and Mary Stanley had become friends back when they were both young mothers. Much later, I would lift Mary Stanley's line, "Envy of Angels," from my song of the same name. That song's about my dad, and in it, I was trying to talk about that spark of the divine that burns deep inside a civil engineer who's trying to design a wharf or a bridge or a drainage system for people that aren't born yet, in the hope that, even when the author of it is long gone, people may still find it useful. Life went on. In the fifth form, another great music teacher, Martin Heath, persuaded the school authorities to pay for a trip to Jack Boddy's Sonic Circus in 1974. We travelled down to Wellington in a van and played a mostly improvised piece using cymbals and tape loops. I must have been still around 15 when my brother-in-law, the late Peter Walker, took me to the clock tower at Auckland University to see From Scratch. 4 guys sitting cross-legged in a square, playing Bakelite lampshades with piano beaters. Peter also took me to see the Mahavishnu Orchestra and introduced me to the poetry of Hone Tūwhare. My dad was retreating into his own way of grieving for my brother, and when he did try to spend time with me, his conservative ideas made me angry, so we didn't have much to say to each other for many years. Peter's arrival on the scene was really important. When I got in my first band at age 15, it was Peter who helped us get our gear to the Auckland Battle of the Bands. He also taught me a lot about sailing. He was an illustrious sailor himself, one of the leading lights in New Zealand's famous win in the Admiral's Cup in 1987. At uni, I studied music with John Rimmer, Douglas Muse, David Griffiths. I got into the University Singers, a small choir conducted by Peter Godfrey. I was never a great tenor, but I used to love the way when we'd be on a trip somewhere, we'd all pile out of the bus and sing in some cave or empty building, just for the love of it. Pieces like Bruckner's Locus Iste ad Deo Factus Est. I still remember that. I pieced together a BA over about 5 years, with many gaps and abandoned papers along the way. I loved the American poetry paper presented by Wystan Curnow and Roger Horrocks. They encouraged students to keep a journal of dreams and impressions, reviews of books read, shows seen, music listened to, instead of handing in assignments. They wouldn't mark them, just check up occasionally that we were making regular entries into the journals. That habit of keeping a journal has stayed with me for nearly 50 years now. I prefer the red hardback Warwick 2B6, you'll be interested to know. But if I'm forced to buy one overseas, I'll settle for anything similar, as long as it's cheap and sturdy. Don't let anybody tell you that a leather moleskin will make you write better. It never did for me anyway. I've got about 15 boxes of journals in storage that my daughter Mo threatens to do something with after I'm gone. When I was about 18, Philip Dadson asked me to join From Scratch. My friend Wayne Laird, who was teaching percussion at Auckland University and who'd pulled me in to write TV scores with him on a cops and robbers thriller called Mortimer's Patch, put in a good word for me with Phil. I loved the rigour and challenge of the From Scratch work. And that was when I first met the writer Jeff Chappell, also a member of the group at the time, and we're all still good friends after all these years. Philip believed, and still believes, that art shouldn't be separated from the world, that artists have a duty to address issues that matter through their work. In Pacific 3210, we chanted the names of Pacific islands destroyed by nuclear testing. A few years later, we'd performed that piece in Paris, protesting the French government's continued testing in the Pacific. We travelled to Papua New Guinea for the South Pacific Arts Festival in 1980. It was an eye-opener for me. Most of the buildings in Port Moresby were stained red up to about chest height because of the locals' habit of chewing betel nuts and then spitting out the crimson juice. I tried some. It was like a mild form of cocaine, or drinking lots of cups of strong coffee. Given that a few years later I found out that I was allergic to caffeine, it was probably a very bad idea. Port Moresby was a scary place. At the opening of the festival, on a large sports field, each national team had to line up behind their flag, having marched into the arena singing and dancing. I'd done some work accompanying Lim's dance company classes by this time, so we nutted out some pieces that we could quickly throw together, with a half dozen Lim's dancers dancing and from scratch providing a beat. We would alternate with the Waihere concert party and somehow give the impression of a representative national performance. The day was really badly organised and dragged on a lot. Some of the national teams got bored, sitting in full costume in the hot sun, and started standing up and challenging the other teams to sing-offs or dance-offs. Some of these challenges got quite aggressive. To make things worse, someone had come up with some LSD tabs earlier on, and I'd been silly enough to take one. So my last memory of the day is me flailing away on some rototom drums that we'd brought with us, with the stadium spinning and swirling with bright colours and a palpable sense of danger. Back in Auckland after that, I would occasionally guest with my friend Richard von Sturmer's band The Plague, which also had my old friend Mark Bell from Model Boats at Milford days, playing guitar. By this time, I was part-time second horn in the Auckland Symphonia, now the Auckland Philharmonia. And after orchestral shows, I would turn up at dodgy, sticky carpeted bars with a trumpet-playing friend of mine, both still in our orchestral tuxedos, and we'd play brass lines behind The Plague, who quite often performed naked, painted with house paint in bright primary colours. Wayne Laird asked me to learn one of the percussion parts in Bartok's Sonata for two pianos and two percussionists, as three of the university music tutors wanted to play that piece. It was so exciting. And I met David Guerin. David, he's here somewhere. One of the two pianists, who's still one of my closest friends 45 years later. I was studying the French horn fairly seriously by now, although my inability, I suppose that's a word, to practice enough was becoming a major issue. The university couldn't find a tutor for me in Auckland, so they flew me standby to Wellington once a week for lessons with Ed White from the NZSO. For about a year, I gave up most of the academic work I was doing at university and focused on my French horn diploma. I was cleaning fishing boats at Voss's shipyard in downtown Auckland and running up the hill to the university every so often for chamber music practices to do a few papers, anthropology with Anne Salmond and Southeast Asian politics with Steve Hoadley, and to sing in the choir, with the other choristers politely edging away from me because I smelt strongly of anti-fouling and barnacles. The shipyard used to service all of Sanford's steel fishing boats, but it also built and maintained beautiful traditional wooden yachts. There was a huge planing machine. When it was turned on, it started at a low F natural and swept slowly up through about 2.5 octaves to a high B natural. When I was sweeping the floor or stacking planks of sweet-smelling kauri or kahikatea, I would sing along with the planing machine, harmonizing with it as it rose and fell. I also mowed lawns for a while with a contractor who would insist on all the team grimly sucking back a full bottle of beer, each in his shed, and Sandringham on Fridays after work. Sometimes I'd have to catch the bus into the city after that and rehearse Bruckner motets with the university singers, dizzy from beer, holding the music with grass-stained hands. Not long after From Scratch came back from Papua New Guinea, I joined the Whiz Kids, which had formed after the breakup of The Plague. I was on saxophone and rhythm guitar, neither of which I could really play, but the punk zeitgeist gave us the key to those long locked doors of technique and finesse. We did a few gigs, but it wasn't long before that band disintegrated too, members defecting centrifugally first to the relative big time of the Crocodiles and then the Swingers. What remained was Mark Bell, Tim Mann and me. We decided that I should play the drums, so I set about learning how to do that. I was living alone in my friend Frank Stark's small warehouse in Auckland by that time. Frank was about to convert the place into a gallery, but he hadn't done that yet. So I set up my drums and a record player and bashed away to records by the Specials, Booker T and the MGs, and the Police. I'd played percussion in brass bands, orchestras and chamber groups, but on the drum set I just had no idea what you were supposed to do with your feet. I worked really hard and I went to sleep in the wee small hours every night with aching muscles and blistered hands. It was the era of PEP schemes. The Blams nailed one in the Manurewa area, and we spent several months driving south in the van every morning, doing performances and workshops in schools and community centres. Before long, we were on the road more than we were in our respective flats. It was an exciting time, playing gigs, driving from town to town, exploring the country. Tim had the gift of the gab and loved setting up tours for us. We didn't make any money. Pretty soon we recorded some early songs and they got played on BFM. Richard Vaughan generously gave us the name Blam Blam Blam, and he also gave us stacks of song lyrics, each one written in capitals on a page of A4, with so much vehemence that the last letter of each line often punctured the paper. We had a practice room in Hudson Street, and we'd jam away for hours and then pick up one of Richard's lyrics from the floor and see if we could make it into a song. Richard's approach to protest writing differed markedly from Philip Dadson's. It was rude, ironic, sarcastic, like the Sex Pistols if Johnny Rotten had read a lot more books. As often happens, I started my own writing in the shadow of these two much more confident artists, Philip and Richard. For the Blams, I wrote something which was a bit like a Richard piece, a song called Respect, a rant in the persona of an irate high school official who'd taken issue with one of our performances during the PEP scheme. Mark Bell and Tim Mann were also writing good stuff, Mark turning out beautifully structured songs with lots of tension and release, and Tim with a more Jackson Pollock free-form approach. Then, one day, I was sitting waiting for sound check to start in a bar in Auckland somewhere, and most of the song Don't Fight It, Marsha, It's Bigger Than Both of Us came into my head. It wasn't a savage, ranting song in the style of Richard. It seemed quiet and personal, although it did have an unreliable narrator, or at least a narrator who didn't seem to realise what a wanker he was. I played it to the band, but it was underwhelming and problematic. It needed a melody played on the euphonium and doubled by the guitar. Who was going to play the drums? We forgot about it for a while, and then one practice we were at a loose end, and Mark said, "Why don't we use the drum machine for that song of yours with the UFO?" So that's what we did. As we got better at playing Marsha, the audience, relieved at having a break from the ear-splitting energy of most of the rest of our set, would seem to lean in, entranced by the simple angularity of it. Marsha was an odd little story with quite flat speech, some strange dreamlike images that I didn't quite understand, and a bolted-on outro that seemed bigger and more transcendent than the story really deserved. I couldn't really believe that I'd written it. One of my favourite authors, the American George Saunders, talks about the moment when, as a writer, you stop trying to climb someone else's mountain and you realise that the small, as he puts it, pile of shit that you're standing on might actually be your mountain. And from then on, your job is merely to keep trying to find that of you, which is authentically you, no matter how perverse and niche that might be. Perhaps this was the moment when I found my own little hill. And since then, all I've had to do is work out what kind of material the hill is made of, how I can make it a bit taller, and what I can see when I stand on top of it. Blam 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 finished suddenly in 1982. We had a van accident in which Tim, the bass player, was seriously injured along with his wife, Carol. It felt like we'd suddenly fallen off the edge of something and nobody really knew what to do. Tim was recovering slowly. I was rattling around, being an itinerant drum teacher at different high schools around Auckland, but I knew it wasn't sustainable. The experience with the band had left me energised but confused, and I gradually realised that I wanted to do something completely different. I wanted to see new things, learn new things. I felt that I'd come too far too fast. Some people were saying that I was a good songwriter, but inside I felt I didn't have a clue. A few months after the Blam accident, From Scratch asked me to rejoin for a trip to London, Paris and New York, so I said yes. I don't remember much about the English part of the from scratch trip, except perhaps taking part in a performance of Cornelius Cardew's The Great Learning. Paris was a hoot, though. We were a kind of living exhibit in the Museum of Modern Art for a month. At 10 a.m, we'd mark out the floor with chalk lines in a large space in the museum, set up the tubes and scaffolding, and play Drum Sing, Pacific 3210, or parts of Gung Ho 123D. At the end of the performance, we'd pack up the tubes, have some time off, before doing it all again at 2 o'clock. After hours, we'd meet up with friends, drink cheap Algerian wine, and explore the city. At one point, Philip decided that we should busk in the square next to the Pompidou Centre. It's a charming part of Phil's approach to music that he likes the idea of just setting up and playing in random places, rather than always being beholden to venues and schedules. For some reason, it fell to me to go and ask the museum about borrowing a van so that we could take the tubes down to the Pompidou Centre. On the day we planned to go, the shabby van we expected didn't arrive, but 2 men in spotless white overalls did, and they carefully put the tubes and scaff pipes in a large refrigerated truck, waving us away with Gallic shrugs when we offered to help, and they drove us very slowly through the city. We set up and played in the Buskers Plaza, facing down threats from scary-looking fire readers and jugglers whose thunder and income we were stealing. But we had a good day, and at the end of it, the 2 guys in white overalls who'd been reading magazines in the truck the whole time painstakingly packed our stuff and took it back to the museum. Much later, I found that the museum had invoiced me for over 1,000 New Zealand dollars at my parents' address in Auckland for the hire of the special art-moving truck and the 2 expert art movers. The invoices kept coming for many years until they finally gave up. Our trip to New York. After the From Scratch gigs in New York, I stayed on, living in a flat with one of Steve Reich's keyboard players, Nurit Tillis. I'd got a grant from the New Zealand Art Council to help me stay in New York for a few months and hopefully sit in on some Laura Dean dancers and musicians' rehearsals and performances and see what I could learn. The Dean Company had toured New Zealand a year or 2 before, so I knew them vaguely. Dance in New York at that time seemed to be everywhere. Wherever you looked on the streets, there were willowy-looking people in leg warmers, smoking cigarettes, waiting for the lights to change so that they could get to class. And I fell in with a bunch of composers and musicians who were accompanying dance as a side hustle. Often one of these accompanists would have another gig, and they'd ask me to deputise for them. I borrowed a flight case with wheels and learnt to navigate the subway system up and down Manhattan, finding out-of-the-way studios, unpacking bongos and other bits and pieces, and doing my best to keep up with hard-bitten dance teachers whose accents I couldn't quite follow. New Yorkers I met would tease me because I was so alien and naive and I didn't understand the idioms. I'd complain about something and they'd say, "Yeah, tell me about it." So I'd tell them about it. Again. My friend Wayne Laird from Scratch stayed on in New York for a while after the rest went home, and he had an uncanny knack of finding cheap tickets to shows. There were cut-price afternoon performances of operas at the Met, special deals on jazz, Afrobeat shows in the West Village, and much else besides. I was like a dry sponge in water. I still had my letter of introduction to the Laura Dean Dance Company, and I felt I should do something about that. So I met with Laura and asked if I could come to a rehearsal and watch them. It so happened that she'd just started thinking about adding another drummer to her ensemble. She'd been working with Peter Gabriel, choreographing a video for him, was excited by the power of rock and roll, and wanted to break out of the restrictions of minimalism. So I was hired. From then on, we had 6 dancers and 2 musicians playing 2 drum sets, timps, and sometimes Laura played synthesizer. There was a big US and world tour planned, leaving in the Northern Hemisphere spring of 1983. When we just started working together in February 1983, Laura gave me her comp tickets to the United States, Laurie Anderson's 2-day performance at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. Anderson, for me, lifted the curtain on everyday things and made them shocking, frightening. The domestic power socket blown up huge as a stage backdrop. A whole piece played by banging different parts of a microphone stand. That made a huge impact on me. But strangely, it was the old Irish ballads that my girlfriend at the time, Rebecca Armstrong, another member of the Reich Ensemble, played me in her apartment, songs of distance and longing for home that planted some resilient seeds in me. Just before we were due to leave on our big tour, I needed a place to stay for a few weeks. John Kalaki, the company manager, said that if I was really careful, I could stay in the dance studio as long as I cleaned up after myself and nobody knew. I couldn't believe my luck. The studio was on 17th Street at the edge of Chelsea, not far from Union Square Park. I could only get in there after hours, but then I had free run of the place. I could play the drums all night and write songs all I wanted. My friend, the Australian dancer and choreographer Gary Lester, was in New York at the time, and I invited him up to the studio one night. We drank a bottle of whiskey together and made an amazing dance and music piece, which neither of us have any memory of. I walked him home down somewhere near Canal Street and woke up in an alley having lost the keys to Laura's studio. I managed to crawl back to 17th Street in time for John, the manager, to open up, but he and I both agreed that that was to be the end of my short tenure as studio manager. On the big tour, we played all over the States, performed in Berlin, Lausanne, a 2-week run at Sadler's Wells in London, and then some strange shows in Bulgaria, East Germany and Yugoslavia as part of the Reagan-era charm offensive. When I came back from that tour, New York was hot, and everybody had a beatbox with Burning Down the House on it. I borrowed an empty apartment in the East Village and started writing some songs, living on rye bread, peanut butter, and $1.99 breakfast specials from a diner on Avenue A. One of the songs, No Plans for Later, turned up on the first Mutton Birds album about eight years later. I started collaborating with my friend Ching Gonzalez from the Laura Dean Company. Ching was later a long-time collaborator with Meredith Monk. We made a duo piece for an AIDS benefit show at PS 122 in New York, and then we made a piece called Flight Paths with several dancers and 4 musicians, including Narit Tillis and Ed Neiman, both from the Steve Reich Ensemble. We performed that in September 1983 in New York and got a good review from Jack Anderson of the New York Times. That month, Daniel Keeley, who was living in New York at the time and who later managed the Mutton Birds, took me to the Forest Hill Stadium in Queens to see Talking Heads' Stop Making Sense show. I had no money by this stage, and some friends who ran a woodworking shop on Hudson Street near Canal said that I could stay there in return for helping glue and sand kitchen cabinets. In the mornings, I'd walk a couple of blocks to the Hudson River and watch the working boats ply back and forth to Hoboken and Jersey City, and the rowers that reminded me of watching my brother competing in the Westlake 8s and 4s on Lake Pupuke. Sometime around then, in the northern autumn of 1983, I made the decision to come back to New Zealand. I wasn't clear in my own mind as to why I exactly decided that. I was making friends in New York. I had a gig in a fancy avant-garde dance company. I could have stayed and had an interesting life. But I could see a lot of work around me that was about making it. A whole bunch of artists clamouring to be heard, looking over their shoulder at other artists who were also clamouring to be heard, trying to find their tiny point of difference. I had an inkling that if I stayed there, I'd only ever make trivial stuff. The big stuff, love, family, loss, fate, belonging, all those things seemed to me to be back in New Zealand, waiting to have songs written about them. And I wanted to at least have a go at that. But this time, I'd got together with Marianne Schultz, one of the Dean dancers, but she wanted to stay in the company, at least for the time being. I didn't, and she didn't even know where New Zealand was. So we parted pretty philosophically with no idea about what was up ahead for us. I got back to New Zealand, taught some classes in songwriting at Paramarimu Prison, became the music teacher for a couple of years at Auckland Metropolitan College. It was a great cohort of divergent, argumentative kids, the likes of Gareth Farr, Ben Howe, Otis and Josh Frizzell, architect David Mitchell's 2 kids, Tessa and Julian. I wasn't much older than them all, and their energy was infectious. I toured to the UK again with From Scratch and performed at the Edinburgh Festival. Part of the New Zealand crew there was John Cousins with his wonderful piece Membrane. I did my first feature film score around this time too. It was a film called Other Halves, directed by John Lang, from a story by Sue Macaulay. I remember one of the producers telling me at short notice that I needed to go to Wellington to have a meeting about the film. He organised my transport and pushed a $100 note into my pocket for sundries. I'd never seen a $100 note before. And I went straight to the nearest second-hand record shop and bought piles of records. I've no idea how the meeting went. When Harry Sinclair came back from the UK, we re-met and decided to start the Front Lawn together. We'd been at Westlake Boys, but in different years, and he'd helped me with the Blam 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 video, and also we'd met briefly when he was passing through New York on the way to studying theatre in Paris. We quickly became a kind of performing arts school of two. We'd drive around from gig to gig, constantly arguing about what it was we were trying to achieve, what work was out there in the world that spoke to us, and how we could make things which were as good or better. Comedy was a byproduct, because silly stuff tended to happen when we were on stage together, but we never really set out to be funny. Quite the contrary. I would bring a fragment of an idea along about, say, madness. Harry would bring something along about memory, and we'd bat those ideas around until we had something we felt we could put in front of people. We'd never know if a fragment was going to turn into a song, a short dancey piece, or a sketch. What followed was 6 years of intense work that Harry and I still can't quite unpack when we try to remember it together. For the last two of those years, we worked with Jennifer Ward-Leland, who, apart from being a fabulous performer, made us brush our ideas up and be more professional. We performed all over the world, including 2 seasons at New York's Dance Theatre Workshop, a stone's throw from the Dean Studio, where Gary Lester and I had made that great lost dance and music work a few years before. Lots had happened during this time. Mary Ann moved from New York to New Zealand. We got married and found a falling down cottage in Kingsland, Auckland. Suddenly I had a wife, a house and a mortgage. I was on the road constantly with the Front Lawn, and Mary Ann was dancing with Limbs and with Douglas Wright and company. In the meantime, we were part of the group that founded the Watershed Theatre. In 1990, I scored An Angel at My Table, directed by Jane Campion, another towering artist that I was so lucky to work with and learn from. When the Front Lawn ran its course, we started the Mutton Birds. I worked for months with David Long from the Six Volts. Then we enlisted Ross Burge, formerly from the Spines, but then living in New York. Then adding Alan Gregg, who'd been in the uncomfortably named Dribbling Darts of Love. We played all over New Zealand before moving to the UK for 4 years during the latter half of the 90s. Mary Ann and I had 2 gorgeous kids by then. In the UK, the band did well. Signed to Virgin UK, made 2 albums, performed to thousands of people all over Europe and on tours to the US, Australia and Canada. We sold a respectable number of records and had great reviews. But in the major label end of the music industry, if you don't burst in with a license to print money, you're considered to be failing. I did feel sometimes that I dragged the band, the crew, my family and our manager's family over there on false pretenses, and that if I could only write a song so perfect that everybody would sit up and take notice, it would all be worthwhile. But I didn't do that. I carried on doing what I've always done, writing what suits me. In spite of the temptation to try to climb someone else's mountain, I stayed on my malodorous hill. A lot of the songs that I wrote were like letters home. Envy of Angels, the letter to my dad that I talked about before, was one of them. Not pop music. Well, possibly unpopular pop music, but certainly not what the record company was hoping for. Lots of good things happened in England, but towards the end of our stay, the absurdities of our situation started to multiply. We were told we had a gig in Germany. Winton Rufer, the great New Zealand striker, had been signed to Kaiserslautern, a town west of Mannheim, and the idea was to celebrate his first game for the club, with a special event highlighting New Zealand food, wine, and music. We learned that we had to mime to one of our songs during half-time. Not the kind of thing we'd signed up for when we started the band, but, you know, good exposure, you never know who might be watching, trip to Germany, yada, yada, yada. However, the kick-a-goal competition that we were supposed to follow had gone on too long because the fans that lined up to kick the goal were so drunk they fell over before reaching the ball. So we ended up waiting a long time on the plywood stage in the middle of the field. On one side of the stage, a giant inflatable kiwi held by guy ropes, and on the other side, a giant inflatable kiwi fruit. I'm not making this up. Thousands of Kaiserslautern fans started slow clapping and the mood started to get ugly. Suddenly our song started playing over the sound system. So we picked up our instruments and started miming furiously. It was a windy day, and just as we started, one of the guy ropes broke, causing the kiwi fruit to lurch threateningly towards Alan, the bass player. A fierce woman with a clipboard rushed across the field towards us, shrieking in German and drawing her finger across her throat repeatedly. Like the hero in a Biggles story, Alan tried manfully to fight off the kiwi fruit with his bass guitar. The image of us on that stage froze in my mind, and no matter what I do, I can't unsee it. It comes back unbidden when someone asks me how it was being on a major label and living in the UK. The song stopped abruptly and we ran back to the tunnel and the dressing rooms. Things like that did start to make me feel like giving up writing songs altogether. And even though I intuitively knew that that would be the end of me, like a fish giving up swimming or a tree giving up trying to find the sunlight, I couldn't find a way out. I felt I could never be a good songwriter, much less a good husband and father. The grief that I'd pushed down when my brother died in 1974 all came to the surface. We had an uninsulated garage next to our house in Finchley Central, northwest London, and in between tours, I'd try to do some writing in there, wearing track pants and an anorak pulled over my pajamas, a balaclava on my head and socks on my hands, trying to write that effortless song that would solve everything. But some days, I'd just curl up on the concrete floor and be unable to move for hours. We didn't stop learning things during that time, though. Our two glorious, sparky kids were providing splashes of insubordinate Antipodean colour at their respective school and playgroup. Marianne did a stint teaching at London Contemporary Dance School. I stumbled on Ted Hughes's anthology By Heart on one tour. In the back of the van on long trips, I learned some of them, including Gerard Manley Hopkins's beautiful poem Inversnade, partly because of the way it tumbled recklessly along, like the stream it described, reminding me of all the anarchic, wild nature back home. After a couple of years, we were dropped by our label Virgin UK, but our new manager Steve Hedges' approach, which he referred to as building the audience one at a time, seemed to be working. We started our own magazine for fans, and at one point that had a bigger circulation than the NME, one of the cherished English music papers. Marianne had completed a master's at Middlesex University. The kids were doing well at school, making lots of friends. But my mum had a major stroke in late 1998, robbing her of almost all language. And that was a catalyst for us to come back, along with the sense that if we were going to move the kids, we should do it earlier in their school years rather than later. So we said goodbye to Britain, the Seasons, the Turkish guys who ran our favourite off-licence down the road, the hardware store that sold lawnmowers on the basis of how quiet they were. Back in New Zealand, we reclaimed our house, which had been rented by friends, then neglected by friends of friends, then eventually trashed by distant acquaintances of friends. And we threw ourselves into work. I wrote the music for a big Y2K event at the end of '99, started work on a long-running TV show, Street Legal. I ended up working on that for 4 straight years. Searching for music to fill the many bar scenes where lawyers and felons had conversations, I came across Sean Donnelly, a shy young bass player who had only released one album at that time, Lost Soul Music. I got a fellowship in the English department at Auckland University, and that, coupled with Sean's encouragement, pushed me towards my first solo album, Warm Hand, released in 2005. I got more and more film work, and with the help of various managers, ever since then, I've been able to juggle film and TV, composing, with putting bands together and travelling around the country playing new and old songs to people. Various Blam 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 and Mutton Birds reunions over the years have kept those ties strong. It's still thrilling to play that old stuff and to reconnect with those good people. I'll finish the autobiographical bit of this talk with one image. I was musical director of WOMAD in 2008. One of the main acts got sick, so I was asked if I could contact Neil Finn to see if he would step in at short notice. Neil did, and he asked me to duet with him in his set for a few songs. After that, he asked me if I'd tour with the band to America, Australia and Europe as solo opening act and then playing various instruments and doing backing vocals with Crowded House. I said I couldn't because I had a big orchestral score to write for Tor Fraser's film Dean Spanley. He said, bring your laptop and write on the road, it'll be fun. And I did. And it was like all the threads of my life were coming together and I wanted for nothing. I'd play the gig with the band. The Crowdies tour was all in beautiful old venues like the Irving Plaza in New York City, the Fillmore in San Francisco, the Orpheum in Los Angeles. Then Everybody else in the band and crew would hunker down in the tour bus for the drive to the next venue, and I would sit up front next to the driver with my headphones on, laptop out, studying Sam Neill or Peter O'Toole in a scene from Toa's beautiful movie. Conducting in the air as I worked out the music that might fit, the driver sometimes looking over and laughing at me if I occasionally sang stuff out loud, the big highways streaming out in front of us and behind us, telling stories, playing my songs, still making up stuff and fooling people with it. Okay, that's the end of the autobiographical bit. Here are some random thoughts. How are you doing out there? You all right? Douglas Lilburn used to think and talk a lot about nationalism. Could we, or should we, find and build a style that was uniquely ours? I've been lucky in that various people have taught me how to be an artist. Richard von Sturmer taught me by his example. Phil Dadson taught me by his example. Both gave me pretty much the same thing. You have to do this, otherwise you get sick. You get up early, you work hard, you think constantly about what it is you're trying to do. When I went to New York, I immersed myself in the work of a lot of artists. Laurie Anderson was one, but also Merce Cunningham, John Cage, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and rock bands that I'd go and see, like the Golden Palominos, Television, Talking Heads. All that, plus the amazing people I've had the good fortune to collaborate with over the years, have helped to turn me into an artist. But what does it mean to be a New Zealand artist, a New Zealand songwriter? Interviewers sometimes tell me that there's a strong sense of place about my songs, and I've had to work out what that meant. I've always felt it best to use the ingredients to hand, not through any nationalistic tendencies, but mainly because I think I'll do better work that way. Pick up a feijoa, right? And it holds your childhood memories of eating them, throwing them at people, the shape of the bushes as you walk past them on your way to school. If you were to have to talk about it, you'd have what your senses tell you about its shape, smell. You'd also have what your imagination might tell you. Maybe it looks like a tiny alien spacecraft. But you'd also have the strong platform of older memories and resonances to draw on. Pick up a pomegranate or some fruit that you've never seen before, and you only have your first impressions to go on. You might also have some literary or mythological information about pomegranates that might help you. But whatever you do, it's going to be harder for you to describe it, to make someone else feel what you felt, taste what you tasted. That's why it's good to work with what you know. And I think that's the key to writing stuff that's of this place. Janet Frame evidently used to say that she preferred catching a bus or walking around cities, because if she took a taxi, she'd arrive at wherever she was going with nothing sticking to her. She also said that you'll never know a place as deeply as the place where you grew up. That's where most of the stuff that's sticking to you comes from. Nationalism, maybe, is not as simple as an idea, perhaps, as it was when artists like Douglas Lilburn were first pondering it. On a from-scratch tour to Japan, I met a Japanese writer after a show who told me that she was terribly jealous of New Zealand writers because, as she said, we could walk up a hill, look down at the view, and perhaps be the first person to have had that insight in exactly that place. Whereas in Japan, she said, you stand and look at a mountain, say, and you can feel the presence of the thousands and thousands of artists who've stood in that spot and had that same idea. I could see what she was getting at, but she was also forgetting something very important, that in Aotearoa, all our hills had been sung into being well before people who looked like me started arriving with their sailing ships and muskets. That's why it's so important for Pākehā artists in Aotearoa to honour te reo and honour the fact that the foundation of our multicultural country is a treaty between two peoples. The treaty that is at long last beginning to return to Māori after a century and a half, more than a century and a half, of patient struggle, their deeply enshrined rights as tangata whenua, while at the same time giving the rest of us the right to also call New Zealand home. We still have a long way to go and a lot of misunderstanding, misinformation and resistance to overcome. But that struggle is what's best about us, in my view. When my song Bathe in the River had been out for a year or so, I was somewhere else in the world, and I got a call from Holly Smith at some odd hour. She said, "You'll never guess where I am." She was at Tūranga Waiwai, performing the song for the signing of the deed of settlement between the Crown and Waikato Tainui to acknowledge historical injustices and to set a path for future co-management of the river. And then, more recently, that song was chosen to be part of a set of songs in English that were to be translated into Te Reo. Both of these were a huge honour to me. It's hard to believe that next year it'll have been 20 years since the release of that song and Toa Fraser's movie number 2, which it was a part of. That river has become a part of my life, along with all the inlets and lakes. People ask me, what can artists do in times like these? Looking at Gaza, Ukraine, the Sudan, the USA, it's hard not to feel despair. We may be buffered by distance down here at the bottom of the world, but the world is closer than it used to be. The books are already being censored. Some days it feels like it won't be long before they're burning. What can somebody like me do? Not much. Somebody might throw in a more general question when I'm doing an interview to sell my latest thing. I might be accidentally sat next to an unruly heckler at a music event. But none of that's going to make much difference. I come back to something I heard the wonderful writer Patricia Grace say on television once. The world needs witnesses. The world needs witnesses. By that, I think she means both in the sense of I'm witnessing this and I'll try to accurately describe it, and also in the sense of I'm bearing witness, offering the truth that's inside me. By describing our own corner in our own words, we shade, colour and crosshatch the places and the people around us so that they can be seen more clearly in all their complexity, so that when we filter that through our craft and make a song, a story, a dance, a painting, someone in the audience can say, I've felt that. That rings true to me. And because of that, that person might feel less alone, more human. Fascism thrives on labeling and dividing people so that they feel scared and want to go back to a bogus golden age when things were simpler. Songs won't stop fascists gaining power, but songwriters and all artists throughout history have certainly been among the first to be silenced when the bullies take over the playground. So we must be doing something right. Art brings hope. It helps people to feel more alive, more like themselves, less like a label. And by doing that, it helps people write the letters, go on the marches, vote, and do all the other things that actually do bring positive change. I started this talk with the notion of bodies of water being like the subconscious, from which come ideas that we can make into art to help us answer the important questions, or like a representation of past, present, and future, or a metaphor for the fear of the unknown that I feel when I'm starting a new song, or the very real, unmetaphorical barrier between Aotearoa and the rest of the world. But there's another way of looking at bodies of water. They're where islands can be found. About 16 years ago, I was showing an overseas musician around Auckland. We were driving around the eastern bays to Karaka Bay, a hidden place that I go to sometimes when I got a few hours to sit and get my bearings. I was giving my friend a commentary on the Gulf and the islands and how we are shaped by the landscape around us and the choreography of sea and land. And I also talked about rangitoto and how it suddenly appeared a bit less than 1,000 years ago. I must have been feeling a bit lost. My marriage was breaking up, and towards the end of the day, I must have said something pessimistic about not being able to see the future and where I fitted into it. And he turned to me and said, "You never know, though. New islands might appear suddenly without warning." New islands, new possibilities. You might find them simply by sailing in a new direction, as Alan Kerno said, or they might appear suddenly out of the sea, like rangitoto, violent, rough on your feet, but somehow miraculous. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Thank you.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you, Don. That was incredibly fascinating, insightful, meaningful, and such a great narrative. My name's Ben Howe. I am the program leader for commercial music at Massey University and also co-owner and director at Flying Nun Records. And relevant to Don, I used to have a very small record label called Archel Records that released Warm Hands and Marvellous Year with Bathe In The River on it. So Don and I go back a long way. And as part of this vote of thanks, I just want to elaborate on my experience as one of those unruly school children at Auckland Metropolitan College. Auckland Metropolitan College, Don didn't say, was what was called an alternative school at the time in Auckland. And when word got out that Don McGlashan was going to come and teach us music, it was big news. And as a result of that big news, and also because it being a free kind of a school, we could pretty much do whatever we wanted, including smoke cigarettes out the front of the school. Pretty much the whole school came to the class. In fact, the entire school came to Don's music class. And my memory of it was Don acted as if that was perfectly normal and was very cool and calm and collected about it, and had the whole class, or the whole school, I should say, doing something within this crazy band that we suddenly formed together. And but it wasn't just like we pots, pans, clapping, anything was. I think there was a bass guitar and a few other things, but there was actually like an incredible level of complexity and musical sophistication that Don somehow managed to get us all to do together as a bunch of argumentative, troublesome punk rockers mostly. And there is a Bodies of Water theme to this, because the song I recall that we spent a lot of time on was Take Me to the River, which I thought was by Talking Heads at the time, but is of course by Al Green. So yeah, much like Don's own mother, who has students come up to, or had students come up to her and say, how inspirational she was to them. Don, I think I can honestly say this, that, if it wasn't for those music classes with Don, I would not have had the life in music that I've had since then. And, it sticks in my mind like a very clear and significant memory. And I want to say thanks, Don, for that. And I also want to say thanks to the Lilburn Trust and the Alexander Turnbull Library. And let's give another round of applause to Don.